Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final seminar in our Decolonizing Deliberative Democracy series. I'm Nicole Curato. I'm a professor at the center. So I begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Decolonizing Deliberative Democracy series is initiated by no other than our very own Hans Asenbaum. So on behalf of the center, I would like to say thank you, Hans, for advancing this conversation. And to those of you who missed our previous seminars, I'm posting the YouTube link of our seminars YouTube page on the chat later. And I hope you find these conversations thought-provoking. While we are on our final seminar topic, I am confident that this will certainly be not the last time that we will talk about decolonizing deliberative democracy. So today we are fortunate to have Associate Professor Ricardo Fabrino Mendonça from the Department of Political Science at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, and a fellow at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, a fellow of the Minas Gerais Research Funding Foundation, and a fellow of the National Institute of Science and Technology for Digital Democracy. So Ricardo is an associate of the center, and he has been actively collaborating with many of us on various projects, most recently with Selene, Hans, and myself on the book Research Methods on Deliberative Democracy. Ricardo has also actively collaborated with Selene and Hans on the role of nonverbal communication in deliberative democracy. And some of you may recall that Ricardo's research center, Margem, was featured in our Center Meets Center event a few months ago. And of course, we also have our very own postdoctoral research fellow, Hans Asenbaum. Hans has written extensively on democratic theory. He is, to me, one of the most creative democratic theorists today. And if you want to check out his work, I suggest you read his brand new publication on doing democratic theory democratically. I will post the link later as well. Hans is currently in Vienna, where it's 1 in the morning, while he waits for his working visa in Australia, which to me is a reminder that we need to radically interrogate the concept of borders. Anyway, Hans, we cannot wait to have you over, but for now, over to you.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Nicole. Yeah, I guess we'll jump right into the paper. I'm going to share my screen. I'll do the first part and then I'll hand over to Ricardo. Okay, so this paper originates in a way in a visit when I was in Minas Gerais with Ricardo at the university. And we started talking about this idea of decolonizing deliberative democracy. And we started conceptualizing this paper. And the paper is still very much a work in progress. We have a lot on paper already, so we have a first draft. But a lot of the things are still shifting around. It's very open to debate, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to present our thoughts here and to discuss them with you. Any critical comments, ideas, suggestions, questions are very welcome. So we're looking forward to the Q&A. So an introduction, decolonizing deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy has obviously very emancipatory goals and ideas about inclusion and equality. But despite these ideas, we have to realize how much deliberative democracy is still rooted in colonial logics, in Western logics, and in capitalist logics. Deliberative democracy is a particular theory emerging at a very particular place of the world, which we often don't realize. So we've been debating this over the past couple of weeks, and what Ricardo and I would like to contribute to this debate is to focus on theory. We've heard about decolonizing mini-publics, which is one practice of deliberative democracy, and many other more practical aspects. So we would like to focus here on theory, the theory of deliberative democracy. But by focusing on theory, we don't in any way say that decolonizing is a metaphor. So we're not talking here about abstract debates in academia, but we're talking about real world impact, because the way we theorize and what theory says impacts how we think about the world, how we perceive the world. And a second point is also that we think theory needs to have real world impact. And a decolonized version of deliberative democracy needs to center on indigenous claims, for example, for returning lands, self-determination, and other such demands. So theory can be very impact oriented, and we think a decolonized deliberative democracy needs to be. So we understand decolonizing not as checking a box, right? This is not an exercise. We are organizing a few seminars or we are writing a few papers and then deliberative democracy is decolonized. Rather, we think that decolonizing needs to be an ethos, that we need to situate at the heart of the deliberative democratic project, and that needs to remain a driving force in the future as well. So what can we contribute in concrete terms rather than abstract ones to decolonizing deliberative democracy? In this paper, in this presentation, we suggest 6 moves towards decolonizing deliberative democracy. The first 3 moves are deconstructive. So we think we need to start by criticizing, by questioning, interrogating deliberative democracy. And through these critique and these questions, we can find the nuances of the colonial legacies that are reflected in deliberative democracy. And upon this deconstruction, we can engage in 3 moves that are reconstructive and that produce, hopefully, a new project from the bottom up of deliberative democracy. So the first move, I'm just briefly going to introduce them, and Ricardo is going to talk about them more. The first deconstructive move is acknowledging the violences of modernity and realizing how the colonial legacies of slavery, of robbing lands of indigenous people, of the inequalities that we see reflected today, how these are also reflected in theories of deliberative democracy. The second move is recognizing epistemic asymmetries in our own communities, right? So we all work internationally. We all know colleagues from different regions, and we can observe how our community is mostly white, mostly, or at least more, also masculine. So we need to reflect on these inequalities within our epistemic community. And the third move then is to criticize the colonial drive of deliberative institutions. So if we look at the idea of democratic innovations as a kind of universal design that can be developed in the West and then exported around the world and work in any other cultural context, we can easily see the colonial underpinnings of this very idea. So upon this critique and upon this deconstruction, we would like to engage in 3 or suggest 3 reconstructive moves. And we think we need to start from the bottom up. We need to theorize inductively, talk to people outside academia, include indigenous knowledges, diversify knowledges into the theorizing process and rethink deliberative democracy from the bottom up. Then we need to engage in an open dialogue with global South scholarship, not in a way that exoticizes deliberative democracy as it is practiced in other countries, but in a respectful, open exchange between these different cultures. And lastly, we think we need to bring all these insights back and bring them into conversation with the emancipatory potential that has always been situated at the heart of deliberative democracy, and that needs to be reread and rediscovered through these lenses, through these inductive lenses, and through global South scholarship. So Ricardo will talk about this more. I'm just gonna end this introduction and then give the first part of the paper as well. We don't want to present a decolonized version of deliberative democracy here in this presentation, but rather what we're presenting here is a meta debate about the steps we think it entails, it needs towards this end of decolonizing deliberative democracy. So we heard in the past couple of weeks several times that deliberative democracy might not be possible to be decolonized. There were some pessimistic voices that said that deliberative democracy is so much tainted by the colonial legacy, so much intertwined with the colonial system and context that we cannot disentangle it. And Ricardo and I say this might be true, but we don't know unless we try, right? So we don't simply want to give up on the deliberative democratic project, but we believe that the emancipatory potential and the emancipatory thought at the center of deliberative democracy is strong and can be captured and can be taken forward. And lastly, we reflect on our own positionalities. One of us comes from the global south, one from the global north, and that gives us different perspectives. And we think that these perspectives are also an advantage for the paper. They bring different perspectives to the paper, and they also reflect the ideas that are at the heart of deliberative democracy, of dialogue across differences. So what is the starting point of our discussion? What are we talking about here? Well, it's obviously deliberative democracy. So we're all familiar with the ideas of deliberative democracy. Just to give a few of the key words and try engage in an exercise of making them strange, right? Look at them from a decolonial perspective, if you will. So there's the exchange of reasons, rationality, justification, legitimacy, inclusion, equality, empathy, listening, common good orientation, opinion change, and convergence. And we can easily see how particular these terms actually are, right? These are not, this is not a universal theory, how much ever it strives to be one. It is actually very particular. It's a Western theory that's emerging from the Enlightenment movement, from a humanist thinking, and also carries liberal thought in it, as well as critical thinking, right? But these are Western concepts. So we can see how rooted deliberative democracy is in the colonial legacies. But we have also seen in the past that deliberative democracy is open to critique and it is adaptive. We have seen feminists and agonists criticizing deliberative democracy, and this has resulted in very productive debates and in changes in deliberative democratic theory. So we are hopeful. So where can we find within the debate of deliberative democracy, where can we find a good starting point for decolonizing deliberative democracy? The liberal, the Rawlsian versions of deliberative democracy might not be the best starting point, right? So we focus here on critical theories of deliberative democracy. And these critical ideas focus on emancipation from all forms of oppression. They generate often bottom-up spaces of deliberation by social movements that stand vis-a-vis the state as counterpublics. Those critical theories also focus on the economy, which is actually rare in the debates of deliberative democracy. And they stress economic inequalities. And not only internationally or globally, they look at these inequalities, but also internally on the micro level in these deliberative settings. Especially feminists talk about internal exclusions, which we think is a fruitful starting point for a decolonizing project that is also sensitive to issues of racial discrimination, for example. So to take this a step forward, we can look at multicultural debates in deliberative democracy. And here there are some voices and some ideas that are really conducive to an idea, a project of decolonizing deliberative democracy. Here again, looking at this micro level, at the forums, these multicultural deliberative democrats criticize that often indigenous or non-Western people feel like they need to assimilate in order to fit into such, for example, a mini public. They need to translate their ideas, they need to translate their language, change their style of presentation in order to be heard. And these deliberative democrats claim a right to self-determination for indigenous people, who want self-determination. So it needs a right to secession. It needs right to form their own institutional structures, maybe within the states. So just to give an example, Iris Marion Young here says, many have been deprived of lands and livelihoods by colonial and post-colonial systems of appropriation and exploitation and have been driven into poverty. Many of these peoples claim a right to self-determination as a means to throw off the yoke of cultural imperialism. So we can see that deliberative democracy can be sensitive to issues of colonialism, slavery, robbed land of indigenous people, and so on. So to close this part of the presentation, we think that there are still many silences in deliberative democracy. Despite these emancipatory traces that we can find in deliberative democratic theory that stress emancipation, confronting colonialism, a right to self-determination, yes, they are a great starting point, a great starting point for decolonizing deliberative democracy. However, the silences are still very prominent, let's say. If you look around in the mainstream deliberative democracy literature, there is a lack of discussion on the global political economy, for example. Debates on deliberative global governance even turn a blind eye on colonialism, don't mention slavery, don't mention the crimes that have been committed in the past and the consequences they still have today. So and another example, comparative democratic theory does look to different cultures around the world, which is a great start, but they often fall back into a kind of extractive thinking where we collect many exotic cases to build the perfect universal theory. And they, in doing so, I would argue, do not respect the particularity of these different cultures. So as a starting point, we see that there is potential, but there are also these silences. So what is the way forward? And I'm going to hand over to Ricardo here.
So thank you for the nice introduction, Nicole. I won't be thanking a lot, but it's a pleasure to be here. But I'll just go straight to the presentation in order to keep the conversation going. But thank you so much for having me here again and for having this conversation. So what I'll try to do now is to unpack some of the arguments that Hans has presented and to discuss what is this decolonial project and what exactly do we mean when we talk about these 6 moves. So decolonial thinking comprehends a diverse and transdisciplinary body of literature pointing to many directions. It is a dynamic movement oriented by the need to think critically about the implications of colonialism. First developed in Latin America as a shift from post-colonial thinking, the decolonizing project seeks to expand and radicalize the critique of colonialism. It was promoted by authors like Quijano, Lugones, Gonzalez, Mignolo, and Balestrin, and we're speaking with their voices here and bringing many of those voices in the presentation here. But the presentation of a detailed and nuanced view of the origins and arguments of decolonial thinking is beyond the scope of this article. More modest, our aim is to argue that the key assumptions of decolonial thinking can provide grounds for a set of moves that are relevant to a process of decolonization of deliberative democracy. The 6 moves proposed aim at taking the inclusive and democratic premises of deliberative theory seriously by using decolonial lenses to critically advance aspects of the theory, thus providing positive and reconstructive ways forward. So as Hans has mentioned, we do believe that this dialogue is fruitful and that we should try to promote bridges on the discussions on deliberative democracy and decolonial thinking, decolonial theory. So Hans, please, next slide. So I'll focus on the 6 moves now, and I'll start with the first move, which is acknowledging the violence of modernity. Decolonizing deliberative democracy requires, first of all, breaking with the narrative of modernity as an age of reason and liberation. The violence of modernity is evident in its deep intertwinement with colonialism and slavery. Racism and xenophobia are not external to modernity, but have been cultivated by its project. And Quijano defines the coloniality of power as centrally grounded on its capacity to classify and establish hierarchies. Power is manifest through the naturalization of the categories that nurture and justify relationships of exploitation and domination. Divisions of race, work, gender, deriving from colonialism, structured and naturalized capitalism in the 16th century. In this sense, Mignolo points out that the unfinished project of modernity, like Habermas talked, is actually the unfinished project of many and updated forms of colonialism. According to Henrique Dussel, what is singular about modernity is the way Europe projects itself and its centrality in relation to the rest of the world, which is constructed as peripheral. And it does so by framing others as barbarians that need to be civilized through disciplinary acts of violence. For Dussel, it is essential to expose the other face of modernity in order to nurture a project of transmodernity, which does not mean denying modernity. Although guided by normative ideals of equality, deliberative Democrats are often silent about the roots of inequalities and forms of oppression in current Western societies, and they remain blind to colonial legacies that entrench global economic inequalities. Decolonizing deliberative democracy requires a critical analysis of modernity. It also requires taking more seriously the criticisms about the acquiescence, this is a difficult word, of the deliberative approach, which has often become a sophisticated expression of the liberal principles derived from the Enlightenment, which takes us to the second move, which is recognizing epistemic asymmetries. The second deconstructive move, aiming to decolonize deliberative democracy, is the clear recognition of the asymmetries pervading the field. Post-colonial and decolonial thinking have emphasized the epistemic dimension of the reproduction of power. They point out to several layers of epistemic injustice. There are class, gender, and racial cleavages cutting across scientific fields, which affect individual recognition, legitimacy, and respect. The epistemic injustices nurtured by modern science are also deeply marked by geopolitical asymmetries, which become clear in the status differentials within the community of deliberative democracy scholarship. The epistemic community of deliberative Democrats reflects trends that are visible across most academic fields. Scholars from the Global South are not only cited less, but also face more difficulties in entering academic networks, facing barriers that range from discrimination to language obstacles and financial limitations to a proper participation in academic forums around the world. These obstacles also point to differences among those who speak on behalf of the Global South. It is much easier to find voices from the Global South that are based on renowned institutions of the Global North. Another dimension of geographical asymmetries is related to the way different regions of the world are framed. As Bambra argues, the Global South is often looked at with anthropological curiosity. The Global North is frequently interested in knowing the Global South as an object, but less open to learn from it and to rethink itself on the grounds of knowledge produced elsewhere. So the field of deliberative democracy is deeply marked by many of the implications of these epistemic asymmetries. It is, first of all, overwhelmingly led by European and North American scholars, often neglecting the theoretical contributions of the Global South. Research usually reduces Asia, Africa, and Latin America to cases that may illustrate a theory, instead of understanding them as loci where theoretical thinking also happens. And this leads us to our third move, which is criticizing the colonial drive of deliberative institutions. So the third deconstructive move calls for a critique of the colonial impetus of deliberative institutions. The growing push to reinvent democracies has sought to promote democratic innovations such as deliberative polls, citizen assemblies, and consensus conferences. And the literature on deliberative institutions only presents particular practices as technologies that can travel to diverse contexts. In addition, deliberative institutions often try to control the messy elements of everyday life by proposing meticulous designs which coordinate invitation mechanisms, facilitation styles, participatory activities, and decision-making procedures. Fishkin deliberative polling is a case in point. Fishkin understands this procedure as a way of knowing public opinion, as if citizens were informed and had the time and opportunity to discuss their views with fellow citizens. There is one universal procedure, he claims, that is capable of leading to some sort of purified public opinion. Among the many factors that explain this trend, we highlight the universalistic assumptions grounding the deliberative approach. Deliberative Democrats tend to assume that design capable of promoting a fair exchange of reasons among participants who are representative of a given public will necessarily enhance democracy. A decolonial lens points to particularly and to cultural groundedness of deliberative institutions. In addition, there is a need to expand what is understood as democratic innovations. Often they emerge like gambiarras, which is a word in Portuguese to speak about the quick fixes in situated contexts, dealing with whatever means available to creatively reinvent politics. A decolonial approach must consider the broader set of practices through which democracy is reinvented. It must also reflect on the very basic definition of what is being reinvented, evaluating and rethinking the normative ideals that steer these innovations, which takes us to move number 4, the inductive theorizing. So we need new starting points for deliberative democracy, which should be located outside academia. Deliberative democracy needs to be grounded on more encompassing range of practices rooted in everyday life and in experiences of marginalized groups. We speak here of Boaventura de Souza Santos' Ecology of Knowledges, that talks about the necessity to make science in close relationship with a wide range of knowledges. Indigenous writers systematically point to this need for dialogue between different forms of knowledge and different epistemological traditions. Ailton Krenak, who is the author of Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, for instance, claims that an ecology of knowledges must integrate the ordinary experiences and practices of indigenous communities to challenge the idea of a homogeneous humanity, which is an abstraction that systematically denies the connections of many different entities, including land, plants, and animals. Similar attempts can be found in the writings of Black feminists from the Global South. Marileia Almeida, for instance, shows how the everyday practices of women in quilombos, which are settlement of descendants of fleeing slaves, are also a source of knowledge to pluralized democracies. Usually conceived of as centers of belligerent resistance, quilombos are also structures of territorial reinvention through affection, imagination, solidarity, and sociability that led to an ethics of freedom with deep political implications. Investigating the ordinary practices of quilombos, Almeida unravels their capacity to display subjectivities and renew political action. So we're inviting to this radical dialogicity, including many different types of knowledge, which is a move on the way by several deliberative Democrats and people on the borders of deliberative democracy. So there is an agenda of participatory and inductive ways of theorizing, informing around the work of Genevieve Fuji-Johnson, who presented previously in the series, Brooke Arkley and colleagues, Marla Brettschneider and Hans Asenbaum, my co-author here. So the fifth move is engaging in an open dialogue with the Global South scholarship. And we advocate an open and truly appreciative engagement with Global South scholarship on deliberative democracy. The Global South should neither be seen as a repository of exotic cases or as a need region deserving complacence. A very interesting example of the sort of move needed is the co-authored book written by David Kopenawa, a Yanomami shaman, and Bruce Albert, a Moroccan anthropologist based in France, titled Falling Sky, in which not only the practices, cosmologies, and perspectives of a Yanomami community are presented, but also a counter-ethnography of the whites, who Kopenawa calls the people of merchandise. According to Viveiro de Castros, with Falling Sky, the level and terms of the poor, sporadic and highly unequal dialogue between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous majority of our country change. Negotiating their differences in mutual intertranslation, nurtured by reciprocal curiosity, they enact a radicality of dialogue, which is not marked by complacence. And here's a quote from Viveiro de Castro about this book. To refuse the indigenous a radically horizontal aesthetic and philosophical dialogue with our society, relegating them to the role of objects of outsourced assistance, clients of an Enlightenment white activism, or victims of a desperate denunciation, is to refuse them their absolute contemporaneity. Similarly, the Black feminism of Lélia Gonzalez is a clear example of diasporic dialogue that seeks to connect multiple voices in an open debate with several layers of translation. Deliberative democracy values dialogue in itself, but dialogue is frequently reduced to an object of study or to something that can be promoted through appropriate designs in order to solve political problems. Proper dialogue could also reshape the relationships within the field of deliberative democracy, allowing not only broader scrutiny of concepts, but also a pluralization of the theoretical instruments employed. And this broader dialogue with the Global South could also shape very concrete forms of academia. The current unacceptability, for instance, of having exclusively masculine panels or journal issues, for instance, has not spread to other forms of inequalities, and it is considered absolutely normal to have many panels in relevant conferences without the participation of a single presenter from the Global South, for instance. The most prestigious research associations in the Global South invest most of their resources to bring researchers from the Global North as their keynote speakers in the quest to promote some form of dialogue, but the opposite is rarely the case. Decolonizing deliberative democracy requires an active and continuous attempt to foster actual dialogue in the sense of mutual displacements through open engagement and intertranslation. And now I go to my final point and last move here, which is focusing on emancipation. So after inductive theorizing with those outside academia and rereading deliberative democracy through knowledge from the Global South, the final reconstructive move consists of refocusing deliberative democracy on equality and emancipation. As an approach historically linked to critical theory, deliberative democracy is oriented by normative principles that seek to transform societies in emancipatory directions. Equality and reflexivity have always been at the heart of deliberative democracy, but deliberative democrats frequently approach these concepts in rather abstract ways. The concrete and specific challenge to oppression is rare in the writings of deliberative democrats. A decolonizing approach to deliberative democracy must face these issues head-on. Social inequalities in their multiple dimensions should be addressed as central aspect constraining the possibilities of a vivid public sphere. Such an approach requires significant attention to political economy and its complexities. Deliberative democrats cannot neglect the significance of distributive justice to democracy. And decolonial thinking acknowledges the centrality of capitalist economies in the creation and reproduction of asymmetries that forestall truly democratic self-government. Inequalities related to gender, race, and sexual orientation must be prioritized by deliberative democrats. Democracies are made of bodies, and the actual existence of these bodies in social contexts affect the way they interact in a polity. Dialogue is often impossible because of the way certain bodies are seen, perceived, and understood. Decolonial thinking also draws attention to the oppression of other beings and entities, inviting a proper comprehension of many forms of oppression and their connections. So to conclude, we believe deliberative democrats are open to change and have taken important steps throughout the development of the field. We also believe several of these moves are on the way. We try to offer these 6 systematic moves that may help this ongoing task, which is collective, and to rethink the field critically. So thank you, and I apologize for reading, but it's the way to organize language and to organize everything in time. But thank you.